Hi, everybody, and welcome to Topic 17.1 Notes, Revolution and Nationalism in Latin America. You should have your question sheet that you received yesterday or the day before in class. At any point in this video, please make sure that you pause it if you need to finish writing an answer or need to review something. In addition, at the end of the video, once you have completed your questions, you will need to take images of those and submit them in the assignment for those questions. Again, just a reminder, pause the video as you need to. We're going to start off with Porfirio, and I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, Diaz, and he was a ruler in Mexico for 35 years. He was known to welcome outsiders to come in and allowed them to invest in the country, but they invest for their profit, not for the country itself. So although he was managed to maintain peace and the economic growth that was happening, the Mexican people were not benefiting from that. So that small group that gained wealth was that elite class that had those connections to those foreign business entities. So the majority of Mexico were either mestizos or Native American peasants. So as I said before, mestizos, and Diaz was also a mestizos. Mestizos are biracial, so meaning that they are Native American and European. So the mestizos or Native American peasants were extremely poor. They worked on haciendas, and haciendas are basically large plantations. So they were a step above slave labor, but barely. Many did try to move to cities, and they went to work in factories. But again, like early European factories and early American factories, they were paid poorly, and they worked in poor conditions. You have a small middle class, and they fell on the liberal side, and they were quite fond of what had been happening in Europe and what had already happened in the United States with the idea of having democratic principles in their government. However, they're not a huge class just yet. So we have Francisco Madero, who is a liberal reformer, and Francisco demanded free elections. So Diaz had him imprisoned, and while he was in prison, he called for revolution. He even had this flag, and he planted it in a symbolic measure. So other revolutionaries heeded Madero's call, which when they pressed Diaz, he would then go on to resign in 1911. But Diaz had actually ruled for over 3 decades, so it wasn't like it was a quickie presidency. So he had been there for quite a long time. So Madero was going to be elected, and he had the problem that he was either too liberal for the conservatives and not enough liberal for the revolutionaries. So he is only in power for a very short time because he's murdered in 1913 by the next leader of Mexico, who was a military dictator, and that is Victoriano Huerta. In each slide, you will notice there are images of them. Huerta, though, was so extreme, he had basically an immediate rebellion against him. So the next individuals who play a huge role in the Mexican Revolution, we have Emiliano Zapata, and so we'll refer to him as Zapata. And you have Francisco Pancho Villa, and we'll refer to him as Pancho Villa. So Zapata is the picture on top, and Pancho Villa is the picture on the bottom. So Zapata was Native American. He was a peasant farmer, and he was successful in his revolt because of his relationship to the peasants and the causes of the peasant. Whereas Pancho Villa was a little bit different. He was a rebel leader up the north. He was more concerned about gaining personal power. Villa was known to go into parts of the United States and attack people and steal things. So his view of leading is a lot different because he was more or less doing what he wanted to do. However, many peasants followed Pancho Villa. They kind of looked at him as a like a Robin Hood type character. Zapata and Villa will eventually join with Venustiano Carranza. I'm sorry, that name was a little bit difficult. And it was kind of peculiar that they joined with him because he's a wealthy landowner. However, he was pushing for political reform. Although he wanted political reform, he didn't want social change, so he didn't want the social structure of society to change at all. He just wanted to change how government functioned. So the fighting during this portion of the revolution lasted for over a decade, and they estimate up to 1 million Mexicans were killed during this fighting. Basically, everybody from every walk of life, except for the uber rich, were pulled into this violent struggle. And with the Mexican Revolution, we see women much more involved in the actual revolution itself. They went from anywhere from following and cooking for the rebels or revolutionaries. They also cared for the wounded. And in addition, the women soldiers, known as soldaderas, they also fought in the war itself alongside the men. So the United States sends the United States President Wilson, who we learned about in World War I. He ends up sending troops down to Mexico a couple of different times. He also sent troops down, initiating with Pancho Villa in New Mexico as well. So his goal was to remove Huerta, to remove Huerta from office. So that was your dictatorship there. And then hunting down Pancho Villa. Villa, again, was notable for raiding different places. New Mexico tended to be his favorite area. And in one particular instance, it led to the killing of 16 Americans. And so Wilson sent troops. They did not find him right away or anything like that, but they kept looking for him. So the guy that they pair up with, Carranza, ends up basically turning them both out and then fighting against them, and which will lead him to becoming the new president of Mexico. However, the revolutionaries forced him to sign a constitution that he did not agree with. Again, he only wanted political reform. He did not want social reform, and the Constitution addressed both of those. Now, he doesn't enforce those reforms, but he's going to have issues in the 1920s in which he'll be assassinated by rival revolutionaries. But what's interesting is that the Constitution survives. Much of that same Constitution is still in effect in Mexico today. There's been some revisions, just like our Constitution here in the United States. So the Constitution's addressed three major issues: land, religion, and labor, which is a little unique because it's completely different than how ours addresses those issues. Out of the three topics, the only thing that's really addressed is religion itself. So in the Constitution, it gave government more control of the economy. It's not to the level of communism by any means, but the federal government had more control on what the day-to-day operations of the economy was. They also, with the land portion, they took those large estates, those haciendas, and started breaking them up. And they also limited on how much land can be owned by foreign investors. The other thing is that they gave government the authority to take over all natural resources, and they took lands that were owned by the church, which the church owned extensive lands, and the church in Mexico would have been Roman Catholic. So they owned an extensive amount of land, and so the government assumes that land and makes it the property of the nation. Now with labor, they issued a minimum wage, and they allowed workers the right to strike. Men were given suffrage, meaning the right to vote, whereas women were actually, this is kind of unusual because they addressed women specifically in the Constitution. It's one of the first to do so, and it gave women certain rights. And one of them was that if they could get equal pay for equal day's work to a male. So if they were capable of doing the same work, they should get the same pay, which is a good idea. It's the way it should be. They also gave married women's rights, which was, again, kind of at the forefront because married women around the world really had minimal to no rights. So they were allowed to draw up contracts. They were allowed to take a part in a legal suit, so like they could sue somebody. And they also had equal authority over the household money. So, which was really important because that meant that their husbands did not have that power over them on that. There was one political party, and it was the Institutional Revolutionary Party to start with. And this was a party that was started by the government of Mexico. And the goal was that it would address various groups. So as listed here, it should address the needs of business, military, peasants, and workers. So their platforms were that they supported reform at the same time they were supporting this reform. They also silenced or suppressed their political opponents. So PRI becomes, which is the nickname of the party, they become basically the main party of Mexico for a very long time, and they dominate Mexican politics until the year 2000. So even though they're supposed to be there for reform, they also, had limited some rights. Successes for PRI is increasing Mexican industry and bringing about stability. So, and again, we continue to see reforms, but whenever you are suppressing your political opponents, that's always a bad thing. We shouldn't be able to suppress the political opponents unless, of course, they're breaking laws. So what reforms were put in place? In the 20s, the government helped Native Americans reclaim land that had been taken from them. In the 30s, the president was President Cardenas, and he arranged to take millions of acres of land and have it redistributed to peasants under a communal program. Now, this borders on communism a little bit. This is very much a socialist ideal. So the idea was to give peasants their own land to be able to farm, but they would do it together so that they could reap more profit. That was the goal behind it, but it didn't necessarily happen that way. Here is an unusual item, especially for the time frame. Labor unions were actually supported by the government. I'm sorry, the slide keeps going back. And then probably the most important thing that they do is they launch an effort to increase literacy in Mexico. This is the very first time, with the help of many, many, many women, they introduced Spanish to native speakers of Native American languages. So the very first time rural Mexicans are learning how to speak Spanish. Now, the reason they want them to do that, they didn't necessarily try to get rid of their native languages, but they wanted them to be able to communicate in Spanish so that the regions and the government would have a better relationship. So there was some issues not only in the petroleum companies, which is oil, but there have been labor disputes with foreign investors that had businesses in Mexico. So Cardenas will lead the effort to nationalize various resources. So he begins with the oil resources. And what that means is that there's no more foreign-owned company in that field. The government will own all those resources. Alrighty, so how does nationalism spread? Well, a lot of it had to do with the fact that economies were booming. So, and they were able to export natural resources and cash crops, which is what funded their economies. In addition, in Latin America, we had more stable governments. At this time, the only ones with a true democratic constitutions were Argentina and Uruguay. Um, uh, there were other nations like Mexico that had a constitution, but they bordered on socialism or were totally socialist. On the other thing that they could have had was a military dictatorship or an oligarchy, which usually included a small group of wealthy landowners. Um, the military dictatorships and those small wealthy landowners tended to really hold the most wealth and power in any of these countries. So things that affect the Latin American economies include the Great Depression, because the prices of export drops and import prices rose, which did not help their economies. It actually hurt them quite significantly. So they created economic nationalism, and this was the idea that they could eliminate any kind of dependence on any foreign power. So that was really important, and on industrial powers, meaning like the United States, Britain, and etc. So economic nationalism was to make them more economically independent. In addition to that, they create companies within their borders of these different countries to make the goods that they normally imported. So problems with that is sometimes it wasn't as good as the import item, or even remotely close to that. And the other thing is that it was actually expensive to do. So they still encouraged those local companies and did not tax them as high, whereas they would put high tariffs or taxes on anything that was being imported from other countries. Again, this was limited success just because they didn't have the resources to build those large industries. And again, because you had that small group that was wealthy and the bulk of the population was not. Anytime you have that unequal distribution of wealth, it actually hurts economic development. Okay, we have Great Depression, and this led to uh, people losing faith in the types of governments they were backing, especially anything with any kind of liberal government. Uh, People are actually supporting those authoritarian governments and strong nationalist goals because it provided more stability. Um, what this ends up doing is just, again, suppressing the opposition and silencing anybody who criticized them, usually by prison or death. And then we have cultural nationalism, and this is the 1920s. This was basically a time of great art, whether it be physical art, as you see in the image there, or writings and just, developing concepts that are culturally found within the region. So specifically blending Western and Native American traditions together. And one thing that has a huge upsurge in Mexico is the mural painting, which this image right here is an example of. And that is a major art form of the Aztec and the Mayans. And finally, the relationship with the United States alters. So the United States invested a lot of money in Latin America, both during and after World War One. The British investment declined significantly, but again, they were dealing with the aftermath of World War One. We would often send troops down to intervene in countries that had a lot of U.S. Interest or investment. And then we also supported leaders who favored us coming into those countries. So it actually encouraged anti-American feelings in several countries by the people because they resented us. So when FDR becomes president, he institutes the good neighbor policy. And this was his approach to Latin America. He agreed that they would stop interfering with Latin American affairs. And he even withdraws the troops from Haiti and Nicaragua. He lifted the Platt Amendment. We talked about that before a little bit off of Cuba, and to allow, again, to give them that little bit more freedom in investment, that they can work with other countries. And this policy was effective through towards the end of the war. However, at the end of 1945, when the war ends and the superpowers exist, um, that will lead to more intervention by us again. And this is after FDR passes. So this is the end of your notes. If you have any questions or concerns, please send me an email. Remember, make sure you upload your notes document into your assignment, and that will be your actual assignment for the day. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of your week or weekend, depending on when you do this.